Before I start, I want to give a huge thanks to these 13 people for helping me make this video possible. I will have all of their channels linked in the description, and for Damone Hardy and Bravo, I will link you their Twitter accounts. These people were willing to give me an hour or more of their time to take a little survey for me, and I greatly appreciate it. And in many cases, it was more like an hour and a half. In some cases, it got to 2 hours or more. If you're watching this video, participants, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. So with that out of the way, let's begin. How should we evaluate athletes? Should we judge them based on how many championships they won, or should we judge them based on what they did as an individual? When I decided to make this video, my goal was to find the right balance between the two because I too often see people on extreme ends of the spectrum. I asked these content makers various sports questions. I had many great conversations with them and I learned a lot. And these people actually shifted my mindset on certain things. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you what everybody said. I will be paraphrasing a little bit, but at the same time, I felt the paraphrasing represented what they said accurately enough. And I'll also be showing clips throughout the video. So with that said, let's start with the first question I asked everybody. The first question I asked these participants was a very basic and a very vague question. What makes a great player, or what makes a great athlete? A very common answer to this question revolved around mentality and hard work. All the answers that had to do with mentality and hard work are written in green. Another common answer I got, which is written in peach, is the individual skill set of a player or an athlete. Other answers I got revolved around leadership and dominance. You might be able to argue that dominance and individual skill sets are the same thing, but I would probably put dominance a step higher than individual skill set. So the biggest takeaway for me when I asked people this question is that to be a great player, you need to be special. You need to have the right mentality, and you need to have a drive that's really almost unmatched. I think Luke G and JMO summed it up really well with these quotes.
One thing about great players is you also have to have some type of God-given talent. No player becomes great in any sport without some type of God-given talent. It's even if you think they came from nothing, it was something about them that was different than everybody else.
I remember they said Jordan would go out, they would have like a 2, 3, 4 hour practice, and Jordan would stay and he wouldn't leave the gym until he shot from whatever spot he missed at least 1,000 times or 300,000, whatever it was. He just kept doing it. And with Kobe, I'll never forget, they said one day a guy got to the gym early. And when he got there, he thinking that he's going to do something special. But Kobe had already thought ahead of him and got there early. And so the guy basically was in the gym, and he said, I'm not going to leave. I'm going to be the last one to leave the gym. And he said, Kobe turned to him and said, the reason I'm the best is because you think you're going to be the last one in the gym, but I can do this all day.
The second question I asked everybody was, what makes a player's career great, or what makes their career successful? I want to start off with what Hook, Cam, and Bravo said really fast.
For being successful, that we expect them to be achieving their minimum level of success. For example, a player able to survive in the NBA, become a role player, a successful contributor to the team, that's a success. But in order to become great, you have to be like the best in your game, like Giannis Antetokounmpo or LeBron James. You don't become great. They are really rare to become great, and it's very common to become successful.
I would have to say, when I answer this question, success and greatness are two different things, because you can have success, you can be good, you can win, but being great is definitely a step above that.
So what do they mean by that? A handful of the people I interviewed did mention that just the fact that you got to the highest level is a success.
If you play one snap in the NFL, that's an incredible success.
Just making it to that level is an achievement itself, because the fact that you made it to that level, so you're the elite of the elite.
Honestly, just making it to the NFL in a way is a successful football career.
But just making it to the highest level is a lot more common than it is to be great. There are a lot of things in sports that you can call a success, be it winning a championship, making it to the highest level, making a Pro Bowl or an All-Star team, etc. And JMO even pointed out what Bravo was alluding to at the beginning of his clip. You don't have to be a star to have a great career, but when you're a star in your own right. I'll let him explain what he means by that.
if you were, let's say, in a situation where you're allowed to be your best and you're surrounded by the best, you're going to only excel and elevate. You know, like it's a lot of role players in basketball that are championship role players, but they're on terrible teams. Example, Bruce Brown. Bruce Brown was a championship role player on the Pistons. I wasn't even the biggest fan because I knew he was a role player, not a star. I always had stated that. But now you put him on the Nets, and now he's a championship role player. And if he ends up winning some championships and he ends up bouncing the teams around in his career and wins three more rings or something like that and becomes a championship role player without even being a star, now you have a guy that had a great career.
But doing all that is a lot more common than being great. To be great, you have to do all that stuff that I listed and then some. And then you have to do it consistently. Just making it to the highest level in any sport is extremely difficult. But having the capabilities of even guys like Shawn Rogers, Norm Cash, Nicholas Kronwall, or Grant Hill is even harder. And then when you talk about being top 10 to 15 all time at a particular sport, or top 10 to 15 all time at a particular position within that sport, I don't think words can describe how difficult it is to reach that level of greatness. And as numerous people that I interviewed pointed out, there are factors outside of a player's control that could affect how successful or great their career will be. But Mitch Milani from the Bottom Line View did say something that I think I strongly agree with.
I think a majority of the time, the really great players are great almost no matter what. Now, they might not be able to have more accolades than another player, but almost certainly, if you are a Hall of Fame talent in your sport, you are going to be in the Hall of Fame.
So Tom Brady, Wayne Gretzky, or Michael Jordan, or really any all-time great would have gotten into the Hall of Fame no matter what team or situation they were drafted to. And as Mitch was alluding to, they might not have ended up becoming the widely accepted GOAT in their particular sports, but they would have still at least been in the conversation. I guess one slight pushback I would give is for players a step below all-time great like Troy Aikman or Ben Roethlisberger. Would those caliber of Hall of Famers have been Hall of Famers if they were drafted somewhere else? Or if we take guys like Carson Palmer or Tony Romo, with Carson Palmer, could he have had a Hall of Fame career if he was drafted to a team that wasn't the Bengals? Or at the very least, could he have been a Hall of Famer if he would have gotten Bruce Arians from the start instead of at the end? And with Tony Romo, could he have had a Hall of Fame career if his supporting cast wasn't so up and down throughout his career, or if he didn't start racking up the injuries? Well, of course, we'll never know at this point, but it's some food for thought. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I disagree with what Mitch said, because, like I said, I mostly agree with that statement. But there are definitely certain players that make me think a little harder about what their career could have been. So we established that success and greatness aren't the same, but as far as success goes, everyone had their own definition of success. Kyle and Jackson even pointed it out. Kyle said it comes down to the personal agenda of a particular player, and Jackson said it's more of a life question. Greatness, on the other hand, you have to be dominant, put up big numbers, play for a long time, have an impact on your sport, and so on. Now, before I go on, I want to note really fast that not one time did any of these participants say you need to win a championship to have a great career. People that won championships were mentioned numerous times, but not once did anyone say you have to win a championship to have a successful or a great career. Championships will come up eventually, but they weren't directly mentioned when I asked people this question. The question I have written here is, how do you prioritize things when ranking and comparing players? When I asked everybody this question, the way I worded it was, when I'm ranking and comparing players, I look at the stats, the eye test, the first team selections, the championships they won, the other overall accolades, maybe even a little bit of personal preference, and then blend it all together. How do you personally prioritize everything when ranking and comparing players? The first answer I want to break down is from the Bottom Line View. The first thing you need to do is separate from era, and you need to take into account the dominance they were in. So we all know that sports evolve and they change. I'll use Bill Russell and Steph Curry for my examples to this answer. We ask all the time, what type of player would Bill Russell be in today's game? I feel like the other side of the question doesn't get asked enough. What type of player would today's stars have been back then? What type of player would Steph Curry have been in the 60s? Is it fair to ask those questions? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think that's the point that Mitch was making. You judge players not by how dominant they would be during a specific time frame. You judge them on how dominant they were when they played. Now, Mitch was the only participant that said something along those lines, but I think he made a very good point. Now, a good chunk of the participants said that the eye test comes first, and that's probably how it should be. However, Nomis did say something interesting about the eye test.
Because I need to see the talent that the person has, how he can fit in for the situation we have, and what we're trying to do. It's always, to me, starts the eye test. Now, the eye test can be wrong, granted, but, you know, the eye test to me is the first thing you do.
Now, to be clear, he said the first thing he does is the eye test and then the stats. And that's how I paraphrased what he said, and that's how it should be. However, he did briefly mention that the eye test can be wrong. If we all had perfect eyes, then we would all be the GM of our favorite franchises, there would never be a bad draft pick, and there would never be a bad free agency signing. And there wouldn't be arguments about how player A is better than player B. We sometimes interpret what we see differently. So I just talked about the downside of the eye test, but I'm going to let Luke G talk about how he uses the eye test and how he interprets what he sees.
So my lion eye is going to tell me what I need to know. So I'll go through and I'll look at a play, and I'll strip that play down to the bare minimum. Rather than say, oh, this is a method because he should have been here. I don't know what play is called, right? I don't know what play is called. So if I'm watching you as a defensive end, and now you get pushed out, I don't care what play is called. There's never a play called that says, hey, allow yourself to be pushed out of the play. So I know there's a problem there, right? Or let's say if it's a cornerback, right? And I can say, oh, they look like they in cover two, right? I can say that. Yeah. But but there are things that I go through and I say, but what did the quarterback do to dictate it? If you're giving people free release in press position, I got problems with that. Beat them up, abuse them, assault them, put them out of bounds. I want him to know that you're gonna be here all day. And so I can see those little things and I'll say, all right, this right here should not be happening. Let me go and look at what other factors could have changed these outcomes. So for example, if the quarterback is under pressure, and he's been under pressure all day, I can go, okay, he did this because he's under pressure all day. If I go back and I look and I see that DN who got pushed out, but I'm saying to myself, okay, what led to that? Oh, they chipped him with a tight end, and then this guy basically just mauled him out, and then the fullback. Okay, I can see that. When I look at the stats are nothing more than a supporting thing for me, for what I saw with my eyes. After I look at the stats, I want to toss out what I know to be the truth and what I know to be a lie. And so one of the things I want to look for is, like if they say, oh, he's got 4 sacks. But then I look up and somebody else ran the quarterback into him while he was getting destroyed on a blocker. Did he technically make the sack? Yeah, but you got your ass whooped right here. And the guy just happened to run into you.
So there were parts of this answer that I trimmed out, but I think we can understand what Luke was getting at. When he looks at a play, he strips it down as much as he can, and he asks himself what factors led to this event happening. I like at the end how Luke mentions that not all stats are equal. These aren't the exact examples that Luke used, but I think it's what he was getting at. The stat sheet will show that Brian Dawkins got an interception in this game, but this was a pretty easy interception for an NFL defensive back to make. Then when we look at this interception by Antonio Cromartie, the pass was a little bit underthrown, but to get up there and snag the ball with one hand like that is pretty impressive. So as far as the stats versus the eye test, I guess you really gotta blend them together. Most of what I've done on this channel is statistical breakdowns, but there really is no substitute for watching the game play out or watching the film. Now, to talk a little bit more about the stats, the eye test was first for JMO, but he said the stats matter, and the examples he used for why they matter are Karl Malone and Carmelo Anthony.
As much as people don't like it in any sport, the stats matter. They do. Like, for example, Carmelo Anthony, he's 11th all time in scoring. You can never tell nobody that he's not a all-time great player. Even if he hadn't won anything, Karl Malone was like what, third or fourth? No, you've never heard you heard people bring up Karl Malone was so great. They barely be bringing up that he ain't won the championship. You know what I mean, PD? They'll bring it up, right? But it's not something that they hammer over the head. You know what I'm saying? That's how great he was.
I feel like that's a good segue into what Detroit Drew mentioned about winning stats. You got to find the thin line in the middle between individual success and team success. One thing he's definitely right about is that the line is a thin one. Carmelo Anthony and Karl Malone are right on the edge of that line. Neither of them won a championship, and with Carmelo Anthony, there were numerous times he even missed the playoffs. But as JMO mentioned, most people barely even hold the lack of hardware against Karl Malone. It's a little bit different for Carmelo Anthony, but are we really going to discount the fact that Carmelo Anthony to this point has scored over 27,000 points? Or are we going to discount the fact that Malone had almost 37,000 points? We probably shouldn't. Neither of those two can be top 10 all time, but you can still call both of them great. So the lack of championships don't take away from the greatness of Carmelo Anthony or Karl Malone. And I think the majority of the people I interviewed would agree with that. Championships were brought up on this slide, but they weren't really prioritized as high as I thought they would be. Kyle from On the Sideline podcast said titles are a factor, but they're not the defining factor. Rachel from RachelMarieSports flat out said championships are a little bit lower for her. Hook Cam gave me how he looks at players as a fan and as a coach. He said from a fan perspective, he looks at the championships and a player's performance in the playoffs, but as a coach, he looks at the film first and foremost. Real from Real Detroit Lions fans mentioned numerous times throughout the time that we were talking that he really values a player's peers' opinions of them. And then numerous people mentioned that you have to combine everything to judge a player. And even though I didn't mention longevity was brought up as well. So when I asked people this question, I learned that there isn't really one correct way to evaluate a player, but you can't just look at one thing. Everything matters when you're doing player rankings. Now that may sound obvious to some of you, but there are a handful of people that it's not as obvious to. The next question was, how does the sport you're discussing affect how you weigh championships versus individual talent? I think Damone's answer sums up what the majority of the people said to this question.
It really just, if it's an individual sport or a sport that requires like lesser people to win, then that's when you look at individual achievement, because like tennis, golf, or something like that, like it's, or boxing and stuff, something like that, then it's like 1 versus 1, right? Like it's you versus the other person, mano y mano, right? That, you know, when it's a team sport, the more players that it requires in that sport, the harder it is to judge that, because then it, you know, there's so many other factors that come into play. You know what I mean? Because it's like with teammates, how good were your teammates? How good was your coaching staff? How good was the, you know, the owner? And things of that nature. So you kind of got to look at it like that.
So in an individual sport, you kind of have to weigh the championships pretty heavily. But then when we go to the team sports, championships weigh differently in each sport. Basketball was pretty widely accepted as the team sport where one player has the most influence on outcomes. JMO said championships mean 25% in football. And if you're talking about basketball, championships mean 50%. If you move to something like hockey, you might be back around that 25% range. Detroit Drew said he thinks the most meaningful championship is the NBA, and he doesn't think it's as important in the NFL. Now, numerous people did say that football is the #1 team sport, but the ring count should still play a role when you're discussing the quarterback position. Jackson said basketball is #1 and quarterback in football is #2. Mitch said he really only judges quarterbacks on championships, Kyle said he would probably judge quarterbacks and basketball stars the most on championships. So I think an interesting conversation can be had on who affects the game more, the quarterback or the NBA star. The way Mitch answered would lead me to believe that he feels the quarterback is the most influential position of the sports he mentioned. The way Kyle answered would lead me to believe that it's a draw for him. Jackson was pretty clear that he views the basketball star as more influential on outcomes than quarterbacks. I feel like J-Mo and Detroit Drew would probably put a star NBA player over a quarterback. Of the people that mentioned quarterbacks in the NBA, more of them leaned towards the NBA star over the quarterback. So for this conversation, we'll say an NBA star is the most influential player in team sports. Baseball and hockey weren't mentioned a bunch, but of the people that did mention baseball and hockey, it almost felt like a draw in terms of which championships mean more for an individual player. Hook Cam said hockey is the number 2 team sport of the sports that he follows. The way Rachel worded her answer, she gave me the impression that she values World Series more than she values Stanley Cups. With Kyle and Jackson, the way I interpreted their answers is that baseball and hockey are pretty much a draw for them. BottomLineView said baseball would probably be the lowest on the spectrum, and he actually said that a star hockey player is similar to a star basketball player. He said when it comes to basketball or hockey, 5 people are on the ice or court at the same time. You have such a greater impact on the game similar to a quarterback. Sports like hockey and basketball, you do have to judge someone on championships. Honestly, what Mitch said about hockey players surprised me a little bit because I've always felt hockey is in that upper echelon in terms of ultimate team sports, with every line seeing the ice in a game and with your star skaters not even playing half the time. But the answer that I was expecting the least came from J-Mo.
This is actually funny. Even though soccer is a probably top 2 team sport, I think championships matter a lot in that sport. Because when you win one, it's like you win 10. You know what I'm saying? When you win a championship in soccer, man, that's like 10. It's like 10 chips, man. That's the value of it. That's the weight. I think soccer championships might actually have the most value when you win one, especially when you win a World Cup.
I like when he brought up the World Cup because, in all honesty, even if you disagree with soccer being a valuable championship, winning a World Cup is extremely valuable. Of all the World Cups in sports, you can easily argue that soccer's has the most weight. I don't know about you guys, but there are times where I honestly forget that there are World Cups in other sports. So based on the answers everybody gave me, and based on the sports that were brought up, the way I would rank championships in terms of weight would be individual sports like golf, tennis, MMA, and boxing and others number 1, and then basketball number 2, then quarterback number 3, then you'd go soccer, hockey, baseball, and then after that, every position that isn't quarterback in football would probably be the lowest on the spectrum. Now, J-Mo was only one of 2 people that brought up soccer in this question, and while he didn't say a lot, he did say enough to convince me that soccer should be number 4 on the spectrum. Now, whether you agree with my personal spectrum or not, I think the majority of you viewers will agree with what Detroit Drew said.
I think that to be in the GOAT conversation in either sport, whether if it's table tennis, water polo, duck, duck, goose, you have to have championships and a lot of them to be the GOAT. Doesn't mean you can't be a great player and an all-time great player. Like I said, Reggie Miller, Charles Barkley, those are some all-time great players, but they can't be the greatest of all time because they don't have any rings, if you get what I'm saying, if that makes sense.
Now, whatever your favorite sport is, be it a sport I've brought up on this slide or a sport that I didn't even mention, I feel pretty confident in saying that if you were to say who you thought the GOAT is, it would probably be someone who won a decent number of championships. And like Detroit Drew said, and like we mentioned on the prior slide, you can be successful or great without winning a championship, but you probably can't be considered the GOAT under those circumstances. So far, we've established that you don't need a championship to be called great, but we also established that you probably can't be the GOAT without championships. So championships should play a role in how we evaluate players, but they can't be the only thing that we evaluate them by. When my first participant decided to give me his time to take this survey for me, I was expecting very different answers than the ones I got to these next 4 questions. However, it did eventually get to a point where I would have been surprised if anybody answered it any other way. The question I have right here is, does a great player that ends his career without a championship make his career inferior to a below average player because that below average player ended his career with 1 championship? I'm not even going to analyze the answers all that much right now. I'm just going to let the participants do the explaining on this one.
Hell no.
Hell no. Okay.
Hell to the no, no, no. Hell to the no.
No. No, I definitely disagree with this, you know.
To me, not a chance.
Absolutely not.
No, because like I said, if it's an individual sport, that's one thing. So if it's an individual sport, like if I got a championship in golf and you don't, I'm sorry, there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. I'm just better than you.
Like it's called like a championship team, not like Nevin Lawson won the Super Bowl.
That below average player didn't have the responsibility. And if he had the same level of responsibility as that great player, then yeah. But you know, then you have to find me an instance of that. Like, you know, like I say, that role player was filling a role. You know what I'm saying? But you know, that role player was filling a role. Role players who win championships aren't over like great Hall of Fame players just because those great Hall of Fame players are great Hall of Fame players for a reason.
I want to expand on that last point that JMO said about the responsibility. And for this example, we're going to use Robert Horry. He nailed the game winner in this game. Good for him. But to say he was the deciding factor in this game or the deciding factor in these finals would be ridiculous. For now, we'll just talk about this game. Robert Horry in this game had 21 points, 7 rebounds, and 2 assists. He actually had a pretty good game. But are we seriously going to ignore that there were 75 other points that were scored in this game? Or the 38 other rebounds the Spurs grabbed? Or the 18 other assists that the Spurs had? Or are we going to ignore the 47 misses that the Spurs forced? Now, I didn't go back and chart everything that Horry did, and he was probably part of some of those forced misses. But I think you get my point. Something led up to this shot. Robert Horry did his part, but the Spurs did their part as well. Now, to sit here and say that this wasn't the most important shot of the game would also be ridiculous, but it was still just one of the 82 total shots that the Spurs attempted, and it was still just one of the 38 shots that the Spurs made. Now, with all of that said about Robert Horry, Detroit Drew brought up a point that very much applies to that shot that we just went over.
Derek Fisher has a handful of championships because he played with Kobe. He is not better than a Chris Paul all time. He's not better than a John Stockton who went to the finals twice and didn't win any. So, I mean, if you're just a role player or slightly good, doesn't make you an all-time great because if someone else was better on those teams that helped get there. Not saying that that guy didn't impact that team. It does help him in terms of legacy, but that's not the end-all, be-all. You know, like I said, AI better than Derek Fisher. He never won anything. So I don't think ultimately if just a good to average player wins one, that makes him better than an all-time great that didn't.
So I'd be completely wrong if I were to say that Robert Horry and Derek Fisher didn't have very successful careers because they did. And like Detroit Drew was kind of alluding to, they both had an impact on their teams with the big shots that they made. But you can't use those championships to say that they're better or that they had more successful careers than any of the guys that Drew mentioned or any of the guys that we've brought up so far. And that leads me to how Bottom Line View mentions that if you talk to these great players, they might say, yes, that below average player had a better career than me. But Jackson and Mitch both alluded to how, as people that analyze sports and put a lot of time and effort into what they do, they need to look beyond just the rings because there's so much more that goes into it. So that prior question was unanimously no. So I asked everybody, is there any number of championships that a below average player can win to make you rank them ahead of a great player? And the answers were still pretty much unanimously no, as you can see by all the red writing. The two responses I want to break down first are from Andrew and Rachel. Andrew said, if you weren't a deciding factor on that, I can't give it to you. And Rachel, in response to my question, asked the question, what is their contribution to those championships? I think what these two are getting at is that it's not good enough to just be on the team. You gotta be playing a high percentage of the snaps, and you need to be dominating the game, and you need to be making the opponents fear you. Detroit Drew and TheBottomLineView were the only two that said there could potentially be a way. Detroit Drew was very thorough on what a below average player would need to do to surpass a great player. The quote I have written here is Andre Iguodala. He won Finals MVP. It has to be a specific title like that. Even then, it would have to be either he did it twice or 3 times. Somewhere along that line, where if they won 4 titles, he would have to be Finals MVP 2 times. So even though it doesn't really appear that there's anything a below average player could do to move ahead of a great player, winning a bunch of championships could change the way a player is viewed, as pointed out by Kyle and Jackson. Jackson noted we might say that the player had a bigger impact than we realized. And Kyle pointed out how, while he might not put Dennis Rodman or Robert Horry in his top 50 players of all time, he does judge them a little more highly because of the amount of winning they were part of. Now, I'm going to show you what TheBottomLineView told me because I didn't write his full answer down, but it ties in very well with what Detroit Drew said.
I mean, it's interesting when you say below average player because I think this is a convoluted question. Because if a below average player is winning 3 championships, would that mean they're not below average? Like,
oh, good question.
I guess it depends on like their role on the, like, for example, because I'm a football guy, thinking it from a football lens and using the quarterback position. If a quarterback won 3 Super Bowls, I don't think they're below average. You know, I think you can win 1 maybe, but like winning 3, it takes a little bit more talent.
So if a below average player did what Detroit Drew said, are they even a below average player at that point? I mean, Drew would probably say that whatever below average player you would want to say successfully completed his scenario is no longer below average because that's the specific scenario he laid out. Let's even just go back to Robert Horry. Obviously, you can't call him great, but is 7 rings enough to make him not a below average player? It's food for thought. But overall, you can't compare a below average player to a great player. Of the 13 people that answered this question, 11 of them said you can't win any number of championships. 2 of them said it would change the way that they view said below average player, but they were also pretty clear with me that it won't make them rank them ahead of a great player. And then 2 of the people that answered this question said it would depend on the context in how those championships were won. So a below average player can't really rank ahead of a great player. There could be a way, but it would probably start by getting past being below average compared to your peers. But what about an average or a good player? The examples I used to define a good/average player when I asked people this question were players like Jordy Nelson, Joe Flacco, Sammy Watkins, Greg Jennings, Kyle Lowry, and players like that. What if they had a championship and a great player didn't? When I asked people this question, it was more of the same, and I think JMO summed up how nearly everybody felt with just a few words. No player is better than a great player unless they're a great player. He did, however, mention that there is one caveat that we will get to on the next slide. While most of the responses to this question were no, Mitch from TheBottomLineView did mention that in some instances you might rank a good player over a great player. Mitch mentioned to me that he would rather start his team with Matthew Stafford over Eli Manning, but he would rank Eli Manning higher on his all-time list. Mitch and I would both consider Matthew Stafford a great quarterback, but based on what I've seen from NFL fans, there's not really any consensus on whether Stafford is great, good, mediocre, or below average. I've seen him get called all 4. But he also said you wouldn't rank Eli Manning ahead of Dan Marino. Mitch only mentioned 2 players, but those 2 players tell me pretty much everything I need to know. Let's start with Matthew Stafford. I defended this man a lot when he was with the Lions, probably to a fault sometimes. I don't really doubt his greatness. However, I know full well that there are people who do. Some other quarterbacks whose greatness might be in question might include guys like Tony Romo, Matt Ryan, Phillip Rivers, Joe Namath, maybe Troy Aikman. I personally don't have any doubts about the greatness of any of them, and I think Mitch and I would probably both agree that we would rather start our team with those guys I just mentioned over Eli Manning, but maybe, just maybe, Eli Manning might have to rank above at least some of them. Then Mitch was pretty clear with me that you would not rank Eli Manning ahead of Dan Marino. I don't know very many people that question the greatness of Dan Marino. Some other quarterbacks whose greatness is basically unquestionable would probably be guys like Aaron Rodgers, Brett Favre, John Elway, Joe Montana, Steve Young. I named guys that won more rings than Eli, as many and some less. But when you're comparing the caliber of quarterbacks that I just mentioned to an Eli Manning caliber quarterback, you can pretty much throw rings out of the discussion. Those guys were so great that they would probably be considered great whether they won 5 rings or whether they won 0. That's how great they were. What I'm getting at here is that not all greatness is equal, and you need to separate all-time greats from just greats. You can argue that Mitch's answer to this question raises another question. What constitutes an all-time great and what constitutes just a great? Like, is Warren Moon a great, an all-time great, or is he somewhere in between? And you can even ask that question of someone like Fran Tarkenton. So for now, I'll let you, the viewer, decide on those ones. Aside from Mitch's answer, let's briefly go over some other answers I got to this question. Kyle told me he would still take the great player any day and to just say they had some bad luck. Hook Cam told me you can tell the caliber of a player by watching the film. You can't tell the caliber of a player by staring at stats and staring at championships. Detroit Drew said I would still rank guys like Giannis, Westbrook, or Harden over guys that won a championship that were just okay to good. Real told me that you can't make that argument in football, but you might be able to make that argument in basketball. So overall, one championship should not cause you to rank a good player over a great player, no matter where that great player falls on the greatness spectrum. So that leads to the next question of, is there any number of championships that a good or average player could win to rank ahead of a great player? Based on the answers I got to this question, the answer for me is kind of, but it would be really hard. Andrew from Real Detroit Lions fans told me it's dependent on who you're comparing, but he's going to need one hell of a lot. He's going to need 4 to 5 or more Super Bowls, or it's not going to be comparable. Detroit Drew said if they won 3, they would have to play and be involved in the game to be involved in that conversation. And then Mitch told me that if a quarterback wins 3 Super Bowls, you're considered a great quarterback no matter what. But now I'm going to let JMO explain his position on this because he did lay out a pretty clear path of what a good player would need to do.
If you got 3 championships and you a good to average player and you got 3 or more, you might be considered better than a great player, depending on how good. You know, even good or average, there's a level to good or average too. But if you're a high-end average or a high-end good and you got 3 chips, yeah, you're better than a great player. Like Shannon Sharp over Tony Gonzalez all day, if you want to go with that. But see, Shannon wasn't a good or average player. He was a great player too. So it's hard to do that because Shannon's a Hall of Famer. I would say, like I said, after great, there's a higher level of that Hall of Fame legendary class to surpass those players. You need to have more rings and be like I said, high end good. Not just like I would say if a guy was like mid-tier good with 4 chips and you had a guy that was like a Hall of Fame legendary like Tony Gonzalez, I'm not picking on him, y'all. But like Tony Gonzalez, to me, he's still not better than Tony. But if he was high-end good, and by high-end good, I mean like how Julian Edelman was in this fucking Super Bowl. Like if he was like that, then you're talking about, well, I love Tony, but did you see what that man was doing? You know what I'm saying? To the point where they're borderline almost great to be on the level with the legendary players. You know what I'm saying? They're not great, but they're borderline, they're close. Like I said, high-end good. And if you high-end good with like, like 4 or 5 chips, and you have to do things that matter. I'm talking about big plays and big moments in the basketball games and playoff time. You know what I'm saying? Like if you got a very high end good player that was always like Klay Thompson. I'll take Klay Thompson over a lot of Karl Malone, for example. And I'm not saying he's better than Karl Malone. That's not what I'm saying, PD. What I'm saying in the grand scheme of all-time greatness, he's higher just because. And I don't know, Klay might be a great player, so maybe he might be too good. Because I think he might be a little, but you see where I'm trying to get at a little bit though.
Yeah, I do see what you're trying to get at.
A little bit too good to put him on a level of Karl, because like Klay is like maybe the second greatest shooter ever, maybe. So it's kind of, but you see where I'm getting at, to the point you had to be at a level of like Klay to put you up with multiple chips. And it's me, I brought up Klay because he's hit big shots and big moments, big game Klay, 36 on OKC. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like Klay is a big game performer in big moments, even if he isn't a superstar. So along with your championships, you had to be a big game performer in big moments in the playoffs, or maybe even in some regular season games. And if you're doing it in regular season games, I need 8 years of consistency of doing that in big moments in regular season games. I know that's a random number, but that's what I need. But like that's what I need, that level of consistency, at least when we're talking about basketball. Now, if you're talking about football, I need 6 years of consistency with that.
There's a couple of points I want to go over. JMO mentions that there's a level above great. On the last slide, I mentioned that you need to separate great from all-time great. JMO referred to all-time great as Hall of Fame legendary. And he also mentioned that there's a spectrum of good like there's a spectrum of great. He was clear that if you're mid-tier good with 4 championships, you can't rank higher than an all-time great. But if you're high-end good with those same 4 championships, you might be able to rank higher than an all-time great. The examples he used for high-end good were Julian Edelman and Klay Thompson. Those 2 guys are probably right on the line between great and good. Some people might consider those 2 great, some might consider them good, and some would consider them somewhere in between. So there could be a path for a good player to surpass a great player, but probably not an all-time great player. JMO did lay out a path for a high-end good player to surpass an all-time great player, but he was the only one that gave an answer like that. Now, if you're comparing a great player to another great player, championships can become a factor in who ranks higher. They can't be the only thing you use, but to say they can't be part of it would be ridiculous. JMO in the clip I just showed you said Shannon Sharpe over Tony Gonzalez. Those are 2 great players. Part of Damone's answer was that you have to compare great players to other great players. And Damone isn't the only one who said that.
I don't think it's a defining factor for a lot of people. I think it can separate a couple different players when they're, so close.
If you're talking about another great player compared to maybe a greater player, but the great player has, better, more Super Bowls or whatever, then the conversation gets murky. Because to me, Tom Brady and Peyton Manning are 2 of the greatest quarterbacks I've ever seen. And in my whole lifetime, I put Peyton Manning above Tom Brady. But at some point when you see Tom Brady getting and he's still great, I'm not saying he's below average at all, but like when you see him gaining all of these Super Bowls, like on another team, and even on the Patriots, those teams were very different several times. So it's like, then how many championships does he have to get for me to put him above Peyton Manning? That's a different story.
And Nomis even made a good point how not everybody on said championship team is remembered. The quote I have written here is that at the end of the day, not everybody on said team is remembered for the championships they had. To me, it's not about the rings. What did they do in those situations? If they were just good at best, I would still go with greatness over good. Now, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of good players that did what they needed to do to win championships, and they do have their place. Rachel and Hookcam both mentioned that if a player is consistently making playoff appearances and winning championships, we should probably judge these players a little more highly. Rachel said maybe it does shift my mindset from maybe I thought they were a good player, now maybe I'm thinking they're great because they have 1 to 2 championships under their belt. And with Hookcam, when talking about good players, said if they're consistently being good, being great, going to the playoffs, making a run, and winning a championship 2 to 3 times, now we need to sit there and go, maybe this dude isn't as bad as I thought he was. So this section isn't to disregard the championships that a good player may have won, but more to say that for the most part, you can't compare the championships of a good player to an all-time great player. Like we mentioned earlier, what's the contribution of these players towards these rings, and what level of responsibility did they have? These good, average, or below average players that won a bunch of championships were extremely successful. And if a good player that won a bunch of championships, we might have to bump that status up from good to great. But championships don't always make player A better than player B unless you're talking about individual sports or unless you're comparing great players to other great players. And even then, there still is probably context that needs to be added. Hopefully I gave some of you viewers some different perspectives on this whole thing. In the next video, I'm going to be taking real-life examples of the last 4 questions, and we're also going to be talking about what you would or should trade in to win championships. That will be all for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.